The whole thing started when I went somewhere I'd usually never go. I just dropped one of our more annoying clients off at the airport, having listened to an earful of his complaints all morning, and I was in no hurry to get back to the office. It was a dreary Tuesday, and hard to get excited about an afternoon of reviewing contracts, so I stopped off in a drab-looking bar restaurant about a mile from the airport, intending to have a leisurely lunch and a beer or two before heading back to the salt mines. I was sitting in a booth enjoying my beer and wondering why it was so hard to get a decent burger in this world, when my attention was caught by a couple coming into the restaurant I watched as they settled into a booth across the room from me. Sitting side by side, the woman was a shapely blonde wearing a short skirt that showed off her attractive legs and a tight pink short-sleeved top. Her companion looked like a thug wannabe who couldn't quite pull it off. He was wearing jeans and a black leather jacket, but he was too skinny for the outfit, and he couldn't really manage the swagger he was attempting. You will understand my high degree of interest in this happy couple when I add that the woman was Shelley, my sister-in-law, and the guy with her was definitely not her husband, my brother Dave. Worse still, they were clearly not just casual acquaintances. They ordered drinks from the waitress and were immediately all over one another, necking unrestrainedly in the booth as I watched in shock. The guy slid one hand up her thigh until it disappeared under the short skirt. Shelley broke their kiss and let her head fall back against the back of the booth. Sighing, the question wasn't whether I was going to do something about this that was a given. The question was, would I be able to restrain myself from beating the crap out of both of them right here in the restaurant? I'd never liked Shelley. I didn't like her when my brother started dating her, and I was pessimistic when he fell head over heels in love with her and announced after just 4 months that they were getting married. Dave was just 23, and I was sure he had no idea what he was getting into, but there was simply no way of telling him that Shell was the moon and stars to him. To me, she was a pretty cheerful, somewhat shallow and selfish girl, not nearly as smart or as interesting as Dave himself. She was bubbly and vivacious, which my fun-loving brother adored, and it seemed to me that they both had the same favorite person, Shelley herself. He would do anything for her, and that's how she liked it. To my pleasant surprise, the first 3 years of their marriage seemed to have been very happy, but the scene playing out 30 feet from me suggested that the happy days were over. The a-hole she was with now had his other hand on Shell's waist and was kissing her neck as he worked her over. Her eyes were closed, so she didn't see me approach, and was startled to say the least when I sat down across the table from them and said, "Well, hello, Shelley. What a nice surprise it was. Comical, actually." Her eyes popped open, and her a-hole boyfriend pulled his hands off her and spun around to look at me. Her face was momentarily startled, then stunned, then truly shocked. Her jaw dropped, and she froze, staring blankly at me. His face held the same startled look for a moment, then turned annoyed before he could speak. I went on cordially. "How have you been? How's Dave, then?" Turning to the a-hole and extending my hand, I said, "My name is Will. I'm Shell's brother-in-law." Her husband's brother. His eyes went wide. He sat, frozen, ignoring my hand. Shelley began to recover herself a little, babbling, "Will, what a nice surprise this is. Robbie, heck. A friend from an old friend. You have your fingers all the way up in her holes there, Robbie?" I asked, still smiling in a friendly way. "It looks like you were really getting her going." At the Shelley gasped. Apparently she'd been hoping I hadn't seen what they'd been up to. Robbie suddenly jumped up, mumbled, "I got to go," and without even a glance back at Shell, walked swiftly out of the restaurant. "Seems like a nice guy," I said casually to Shell. Why'd he leave so suddenly? Inside, I was absolutely icy with rage. My brother adored this woman, would do anything for her, and this was how she treated him, screwing around with some lowlife with greasy hair and a bad Matt Dillon mustache. Shelley looked terrified. Her face was white. "Will, I think you must have gotten the wrong idea. We were just—" Her voice trailed off. She had no idea how to end that sentence. I watched her for a minute before I spoke. "You lousy, cheating 304. I kept my voice down, but I'm sure my fury was very obvious. "Dave adores you. Gives you everything you could ever ask for, but that's not enough for you, is it? You've got to go screwing around behind his back with sleazy jerks like this guy. How long has this been going on? Huh, how many other guys are you screwing? What do you think Dave will think about all this? No, Will, please." She grabbed my hand and clutched it desperately. Please, you can't tell him. Please, I'll do anything. I just looked at her. Not tell my only brother that his wife was cheating on him." Shell was either dumber than dirt or too stunned to be thinking clearly. Dave was my best friend and had been since we were kids. I'd do anything for him, and even Shell had to realize that I pulled my hand free of hers. Why shouldn't I tell him? Doesn't he deserve to know who Hun's really married to? Her eyes were wild, and I could see her thinking frantically, "Listen, Will, you can't tell him. He'll be so hurt. Will, if you promise you won't tell him?" I sat back with a smile. This should be good. What was she going to offer in return to screw me to Shelley seemed to decide something, and her expression changed. "Will, if you promise not to tell Dave, I'll tell you the whole story about it. She's doing it too. She's been cheating on you." I laughed out loud. "That's good, Shelley. I wondered what you'd come up with, but I never thought it would be anything as far-fetched as that. I'll give you credit for imagination." Shell just looked at me steadily. "I'm not kidding. Well, she's been seeing this guy from the health club for at least a couple of weeks now." Her certainty rattled me a little, but I knew it was impossible. And I had been together since our sophomore year at Kenyon College. We moved in together after graduation and gotten married a year later. That made 7 happy years of marriage and 10 years together all told, and was devoted to me. She was sensible, kind, thoughtful, and the most honest person I knew, and she loved me. I was sure of it, as sure as I was of my own love for her. Her Shell leaned forward. She must have sensed my confusion. "I'm telling you the truth, Will, and told me about it last week. She said he was very large." I watched her face, trying to pull my own thoughts together. Shelley had gotten over her own terror. At least for the moment she looked calm and in control, like someone who knew what she was doing, rather than someone spinning a wild and desperate tale. I still couldn't believe what she was saying, but suddenly I couldn't dismiss it either at first, and had been pretty reluctant about joining the health club, and for a couple of years I'd used the exercise room much more than she had. But lately she had become a regular, working out 3 times a week, and there had been a couple of odd moments at home lately, moments when she seemed to avoid my eyes or to be a little preoccupied. As we sat at the dinner table, I looked back at Shelley, who seemed to be waiting for my next move. There was no way I would conceal her adultery from Dave, but she didn't have to know that, and I absolutely had to know the truth about it one way or the other. "All right, Shelley," I said slowly. "Maybe we can come to an agreement about this." I thought some more, then went on. "I'm not about to let and run around on me. If you can help me get the goods on her, then I won't tell Dave what I've seen this afternoon. That is, if you swear you won't see that a-hole Robbie again, or any other man besides Dave." Her face glowed with relief. "I swear, will you have my word on it, like that was worth anything to me? What do you want me to do?" she asked me. "I want to hear all about Anna Fairman herself, and her own words. I'll give you a tape recorder to hide in your apartment you invite. And over, give her some wine and make girl talk with her, get her to tell you all about it. I want to know who the guy is, when and how it started. How often she's been with him, and why she thinks it's okay to be cheating some other guy behind my back." As I spoke to Shelley, I realized that I was already halfway believing her crazy story about it. Cheating, the idea infuriated me. Shell was nodding. "Okay, well, I can do that. You probably need to soften her up. Make sure you tell her the details about your affair, too, so it will feel like a real intimate conversation. By the way," I continued sarcastically, "is Robbie the only one who's been getting into your pants? Or are there others?" "He's the only one," she said, quickly flushing, and I didn't believe her for a minute. 20 minutes later, I was driving back to the office, thinking grim thoughts about the end of Dave's marriage and the possible end of mine. You might think my first call would have been to Dave to tell him what I'd seen Shelley doing, but I knew I couldn't do it. I had always been the steady older brother, and Dave the charming and outgoing younger one. He had lots of girlfriends in high school and college, though none of them lasted all that long because he had no shyness and could talk to anybody. One of his college roommates said once that Dave could talk the pants off a snake. It actually makes no sense when you think about it. But we all knew what he meant. But for some reason, when Dave met Shelley, everything changed. Instead of being the charming, confident guy who had women pursuing him, he became the Lovick schoolboy. Within a month or 2, Shelley had Dave completely mesmerized. He was determined to marry her, and no one could even attempt to talk him out of it. Dave absolutely worshipped Shelley to him. She could do no wrong. I'd once made the mistake of mildly criticizing her about a tactless remark she'd made to her mom. He blew up and wouldn't talk to me for a week, so I knew I couldn't speak to Dave until I had the tape. He simply wouldn't believe she was cheating unless he heard the words from her own lips. I realized that I was hoping against hope that somehow Shell was just lying or wrong and was faithful to me. But it seemed less and less likely Shelley could have lied to me out of desperation, but then I would just have been even angrier when I learned it was all. When I got to my office, I took out a pad and made some notes about what steps I'd have to take if the worst turned out to be true credit cards selling the house title to the cars, etc. How I hoped I'd be able to throw that sheet of paper away in a few days when I got home at dinner time and was cheerfully humming in the kitchen as she put food on the table. She greeted me with a big hug and a kiss and seemed the same loving wife I'd been happy to see at the end of the day. For the past 7 years, I knew I'd have to conceal my suspicions for a few days, play the innocent husband, but it wasn't easy. I loved her, but underneath the surface I was furious and hurt, and not sure whether I should be. We chatted amiably through dinner, but during dessert when she mentioned she'd worked. Out at the health club that day, I couldn't resist a little probing. "You've been so conscientious about your workouts lately, sweetheart," I said casually. "Are they giving out free ice cream down at the club these days?" She laughed, but I noticed a slight flush come to her face. "No, honey, I've just been enjoying how good it feels to have a good sweaty workout, then shower and come home to my loving husband. Plus, a few weeks ago, those black slacks you like were starting to be a bit too tight for me. Now they fit perfectly." She beamed at me affectionately, and I was struck by how lovely she looked and how much I cared for her. God help her if she really was cheating around on me, and God help me too. Never mind what the court calendar officially said, my marriage actually ended exactly 1 week later on another Tuesday. Shelley and I had set it all up. I got a small tape recorder for her to hide in her living room, and she arranged for and to drop in for lunch on Tuesday afternoon and had a day off from work. And Shelley doesn't have a job. I sat all that afternoon in my office pretending to work, thinking only about what the women were talking about and what it would mean for my life. At 4:30, Shelley called and said we're all done. "And I'm just gone home. Did she talk to you about it?" I asked, still praying this was all a mistake. "Oh, yes," Shelley giggled. "She was obviously a little drunk. I told her about Robbie, and she told me about Moran, all about Moran." She giggled again. "It seems he is a really big fella. I realized I was squeezing the phone so tight, my fingers ached all right. I said I'll drop by in 20 minutes when I got to Shelley's." She met me at the door with the tape recorder in her hand. "Now remember, will you promise?" "Yes, Shelley, he won't hear a word from me, and you can't let and know that I taped her ever, or else Sheck be furious, and Sheck tell Dave." I just nodded, then turned and left. That evening was one of the most painful of my life. I knew I couldn't listen to the tape and was asleep until then. I had to keep pretending to be the loving husband, and was still a little tipsy. She told me she'd spent the afternoon with Shelley and had a lot of wine, and what's more, she was amorous. No, make that horny. As soon as the dinner dishes were cleared, she was dragging me towards the bedroom, saying, "Honey, have you got a little something for me tonight?" in a flirtatious tone. Could I do this? Did I want to do this? It occurred to me that it might be the last time I'd ever have sex within, and I was still hoping against all reason that she might not have been unfaithful. So I followed her into the bedroom, and we had sex. It wasn't making love. At least not for me. My heart was too torn and my mind too worried and seemed oblivious. Though she was eager and responsive for me, it was bittersweet, pleasurable, but incredibly sad. We rested for a while in one another's arms, then did it again a few minutes later and was fast asleep, snoring gently on her side next to me. I sat in the guest room, the door closed behind me, and listened to the tape. The first few minutes of conversation between Shelley and were breezy and casual. Shelley kept the wine flowing, and after a little while, told and she had a confession to make, she went on to talk about her affair with the a-hole, Robbie. It was quite clear that, and knew about the affair already, Shelley was just giving her the juicy details to soften her up. In fact, Shelley did her job beautifully. She even confessed with a laugh that Robbie was just the latest, not the best, that had been a guy named Ellis, but unfortunately, he'd moved out of town, and giggled and pretended to be shocked. But she seemed to be enjoying the story. Listening to the sleazy story didn't have much effect on me. I already knew what Shell was, and the explicit details would just make it that much easier to convince Dave that she really had cheated on him. I waited anxiously for what I knew was coming, resisting the urge to fast-forward the tape. Finally, Shelley turned the conversation to, "And so, sweetie, let me hear your story." Now she giggled. "All you've told me is that you met him at the health club, and that he's, Well, in doubt, my body froze at the sound of In's voice as she laughed and said, "Oh yes, he's amazing, by far the biggest one I've ever seen or felt." She giggled and went on. I didn't think it would even fit inside me at first, but oh my God, does it ever fit at that? Both women laughed hard. I stopped the tape and sat back in my chair. My marriage was over. Did I even want to hear the rest? I could let my lawyer listen to it. I thought for a while, then switched the machine back on. I might as well face it all now, get the whole story out, deal with all the anger and pain, and begin to figure out what the rest of my life was. Going to be like, how did it start? Shelley was asking, well, the first thing I've got to tell you is that I never meant to cheat on Will. I still can't believe I'm doing it, and I feel terrible about it. He and I are so happy together, and I know he'd go crazy if he knew about it. I guess I've just got a bad case of BDF. She laughed, and I heard Shelley say, BDF, what's that? And laughed again and said, I'll explain. Just give me some more of that wine. You know, I've been going to the health club for a couple of years now. Working out really bores me, but I just didn't want to get saggy and have Will start to lose interest. You know what I mean? Anyway, a couple of months ago, I started seeing this new trainer working there, very hot. Not that tall, but broad shoulders and amazing muscles. His name is Marin, of all things. Can you believe it? He flirts a lot with all the women, helping them set up the machines, racking weights for them spotting while they lift. And so on. One day I saw him talking quietly with Patty Mallister, a woman I used to work with. She's a redhead, really stacked well. I watched them chatting, then he disappeared into his office at the back. A couple of minutes later, I happened to glance around, and I saw Patty quietly go into the office. I smiled to myself since it was clear what was going on, but I still didn't think much about it until later I'd finished my workout and was starting to change in the locker room when Patty came in. Boy, did she ever look well-drilled. She had that dreamy eye look and a vague smile, all happy and exhausted at the same time. I said, "Hi, Patty, what's up? You look awful happy." And she grinned at me and said, "Oh, yeah, I've got a bad case of BTF, I said. BTF, and she giggled, looked around to make sure no one could hear her, and answered, big tool fever. Then she sat down and told me all about her, and Moran, how he was a sensational sex partner, had a huge tool, really thick, and it drove her crazy. He'd been flirting with her, and then one day got her hot enough to talk her into his office. Since then, they'd been screwing whenever she could get to the club. She said he was incredible, the craziest sex she'd ever had. Needless to say, that got my attention, but I still didn't plan to do anything about it. Patty's divorced. She can play with whoever she likes, but I'm a happily married lady. Still, over the next couple of weeks, I got more and more curious about Mary and responded with more interest when he flirted with me, he brushed against me, or touched my shoulder while helping me on the machines. You know, then one day I was doing bench presses. The place was pretty empty, no one around, and he came and stood just behind my head as if to spot me. As I looked up, there were his shorts right above my head, and there was that monstrous package bulging out like crazy. I couldn't believe how big and thick it looked in his shorts. He just smiled down at me, knowing what I was looking at. I almost dropped the bar on my chest, but I managed to finish my reps. As I put the bar back up on the rack, he took my hand off the bar and slid it gently down over his shorts. His tool felt as enormous as it looked, and it was hard as a rock then. After a couple of minutes, he gently pulled me to my feet, looked around to see no one was there, and let me by the hand into his office. I wasn't thinking, I was kind of dazed. He locked the door behind us, sat me down in a chair, and without a word pulled off his shorts and stood in front of me. I swear I wasn't thinking at all we had wild sex. By the time he finished, I was beside myself, exhausted and totally screwed out. "Wow!" said Shelley, and it sounded like she really meant it. "That sounds unbelievable, and I assume you've kept seeing him well that day." I just drifted out of his office and into the shower, all dreamy and weak in the sense I was wiped out. You know, then by the time I cleaned up and got home, the guilt was killing me. I couldn't believe I had cheated on Will, and I was terrified. I just knew he'd see it in my eyes as soon as he got home. But amazingly enough, he didn't. That night was normal. He didn't suspect a thing. He even wanted to make love, but I was afraid he'd feel how loose I was. So I told him I was too tired. But the next night I really gave him the full treatment. We did it until he couldn't get it up anymore for 2 weeks. I stayed away from the gym. I just knew I couldn't be anywhere near Moran without being tempted again. Finally, I told myself it had been a one-time thing. I was a grown woman with a wonderful husband, and I could resist him, so I started going back. And the first couple of times, it was fine. Moran winked at me and flirted a little, but he left me alone, and I thought, this is okay, I'm over this, and I relaxed my guard a little. Then, about a week after that, he caught me again at the bench, and the room was empty. and he got my hand on his tool, and in no time you were back in his office." Shelley finished her sentence, and it was even better, and said kind of dreamily, "I can't really describe it. Shelley, I love sex with. Will we always satisfy each other? I'd never even been tempted to fool around before. There's a guy in my office named Alex, incredibly cute, in a total flirt. He had a lot of success with the other girls, but he never got anywhere with me. I just wasn't interested, but with Moran it was like, I'd never even been screwed before. I can't believe I'm telling you this," she said, giggling. "It's not even that there's anything special about Moran. I'm not the least bit interested in him as a person or a lover or anything, but the sex, just God's gift." She laughed again, and Shelley joined her. I listened to the two of them and felt the anger coursing in my veins. I sat through the rest of the tape, but there wasn't much more once he'd sex with her a second time and gave up all attempts to resist. She'd been doing him 2 to 3 times a week for nearly a month, and there was no sign she was ready to stop. In fact, she said that she'd been enjoying sex with me more lately as well. Perhaps because her secret was kind of a turn-on. It was clear that her BTF had overcome whatever guilt she might be feeling about betraying me the love of her life. Her husband of 7 years, the man who was completely devoted to her and who still remembered what forsaking all others was supposed to mean. It took a while to think through my plans, and it was 2:30 a.m. by the time I went asleep in the guest room. I was done seeing and sleeping next to her, or even talking to her. I slipped into the bedroom and got clothes for the next day without waking her at 6:30 a.m. I was up and out the door. I left the briefest, coldest note I could without tipping in off, say, by calling her, "You adulterous witch. Have an early meeting. Sorry, forgot to mention it last night at the office. I made 2 copies of the tape, and by 8:30 I was on the phone. My best friend from college worked at a law firm downtown. Hey, Eddie, will I have a big favor to ask? Could you get me an hour this morning with the meanest, most bloodthirsty divorced lawyer in your firm?" There was a silence, and then he said, "Oh my God, will not you?" And then, "I'm so sorry we talked a little longer." And at precisely 11:15, Eddie showed me into the office of Margaret Adamson, a lead partner in his firm. Eddie had told me she was absolutely terrifying when she swims in the ocean. "The sharks get out of the way," is how he put it, and Margaret's look and handshake confirmed that she meant business. I was already glad she'd be my attorney and not an I played her and Eddie, and part of the tape, after hearing the first few moments, Margaret picked up her phone, said, "Hold my calls," and we listened to the rest. When it was over, we sat in silence for a minute. Then she just said, "Okay, what do you want? I want to divorce her for adultery. None of this irreconcilable differences. I'll be reasonable about our savings, but I want the house, and she has to take her maiden name back. She doesn't deserve to be Mrs. Will Harris any longer." Margaret nodded, looking at me intently. Then she said, "Excuse me, Will, can you let me and Eddie knock the legal details of this around for a few minutes in no more than 5 minutes?" I was back in her office, and she was raring to go. "The divorce is easy, and there's no way she will refuse your terms now. You should know that the tape will be inadmissible since she didn't know about it. Oh, by the way, will the other person, your sister-in-law, you said, testify that it's authentic if necessary?" I gasped. "This is where it gets complicated," I said, and explained about Shelley's cheating on my brother, her offer to me, and what was on the first part of the tape. "I haven't told my brother yet, but I have to. He's going to be as devastated as I am, and I can't keep it from him. In fact," I said with an ironic smile, "I wonder, Margaret, whether you consider handling his divorce as well." She just looked at Eddie, then back at me. "Let's start by hearing your sister-in-law's part of the tape." I played it for them, and then Margaret and Eddie again huddled without me for a few minutes when we were sitting together again. She said, "Quite a pair of wives, you two." She saw my face and said, "I'm sorry, Will, I shouldn't have said that. Here's the situation. In all probability, the tape would not be admissible against, and because she didn't know it was being made, on the other hand, Shelley could be subpoenaed and made to testify as to what, and told her, so it shouldn't make much difference. Once S's attorney hears the tape, he won't be in much position to fight in your brother Dave's case. The tape is admissible because Shell knew she was being recorded, so she's got no defines whatsoever that divorce will be easy, as long as he's not totally unreasonable. Then there's the health club we can sue both them in. Moran won't have much money, presumably, but Eddie and I can pretty much guarantee you a nice big check from the club somewhere in the high 6 figures to $1.5 million. The tape could be used in a civil lawsuit, and there's no way in hell they would ever let this get into the newspapers. Think of all the husbands who'd be canceling their Wise Club memberships. She laughed for a moment, though even then she still looked scary. Margaret said she'd get the divorce documents started, and Eddie walked me out of the office. I am so sorry. Well, Margaret will get you what you want. I guarantee it, but I still feel terrible about what's happened. I tried to smile. It's okay, Eddie. This just means you and I will have more time to play tennis together. I thanked him and left the rest of the day. I submerged myself in details. I arranged a locksmith to meet me at the house at 4:30. I made a dinner date with Dave so I wouldn't be around when. And came home, I cut off her credit cards and arranged separate accounts for our money, and I wrote her a note. It took several tries, not easy to say goodbye to the love of your life, even under these circumstances. When I finally finished it, I put it in an envelope, wrote Ann's name on the front, and took it home. The locksmith finished by about 5:15. I had a beer sitting by myself quietly in the kitchen. Then I taped the note to the outside of the front door, locked it, and left. I knew and would be home between 6 o'clock and 6:30. I oddly wondered what she'd do first, try the door and find her key didn't work, or read the note, our marriage is over now. You'll be free to play around all you want with Marion and his big tool. I've had the locks changed. If you want to get your clothing and personal things, call my attorney. I left Margaret's name and number. Sheck arranged for you to have supervised access to the house when I'm not here. I won't be talking to you again. You broke my heart. I loved you as much as any man can love a woman, and I looked forward to our growing old together, too. Bad our marriage vows didn't mean as much to you as some sex with a big tool, or as much as they did to me when Dave joined me for dinner. He could tell right away that something was up, we ordered, and I just took a deep breath and said it. And had been cheating on me. I'm divorcing her. He stared at me literally open-mouthed. I'm not sure I'd ever seen that before. Oh my God, Will, my God, and are you sure? He took a look at my face and said, sorry, stupid question. Do you want to tell me about it? I did. While we sat and ate, the beers helped, but sharing my hurt and despair with my best friend helped more. He was 100% on my side, no divided loyalties, and it meant a lot towards the end of dinner. I said, there's one part of it I haven't told you. Shelley is the one who got me proof she taped a conversation of her and in talking, and then told her the whole sorry business. He looked at me sympathetically, and Saidi, just so sorry, Will, and I hope it won't make you angry, but I feel so lucky, you know, having a fantastic wife like Shelley. I'm not surprised she helped you. She's always liked you. I know you haven't always approved of her, but I couldn't let him continue. It was killing me to hear him say these things about his 304 of a wife. I interrupted in the middle of his sentence. Listen, Dave, wait, don't say anything else. Let me pay the bill and I need you to come back to the house with me. There was a note stuck under the screen door marked Will in, and flowery handwriting. I dropped it on the hall table without reading it and led him into the guest room. Dave, listen. This is serious. You know I love you, you're my best friend, and I would never do anything to hurt you. Right? He regarded me wayly. We didn't usually talk to each other that way. Of course, Will, what the hell? You need to hear the tape Shelley made. Just sit here and listen to it. I'll be in the other room. I rewound the tape to the beginning and pushed the tape recorder over to him, ignoring his surprised look, and left the room. I couldn't stand to be there. While he listened, there was quiet at first, except for the murmuring of the voices on the tape. Then a crash, and I figured Dave had thrown an ashtray or something. I heard him pacing the tape, still playing, and then finally silence. He stomped into the kitchen, staring at me wild-eyed. You son of a witch, Dave, you must have enjoyed this. You 304, knowing the truth about Shelley and keeping it from me, letting me go on and on about how wonderful she is. No, Dave, it wasn't. This must make you feel just great, you prick. You've always hated her, and now you can smile at me and say, I told you so for the rest of your life, you creep. I stood up and raised my voice a little. Dave, what did I just find out about it? You think I'm having such a great day? I glared at him, and gradually his face relaxed. I saw his shoulders sag, and he unclenched his fists. He sat down at the table looking like an old man. I imagined I've looked like that a lot lately myself. Sorry. Well, he said finally, I know you're hurting just like I am. It's just, you obviously knew about this. Why didn't you tell me, Dave? I said as gently as I could. You know how you are about Shelley? You would never have believed me. Remember that fight we had when I criticized something she'd said to Mom? I found out about Shell a week ago, and I knew that I couldn't possibly tell you. You had to hear it for yourself. I only got the tape from her yesterday. The two of us emptied a few beer bottles while I told Dave the whole story. I began with seeing Shelley and Robbie at the restaurant, then the deal she offered me, the making of the tape, and my conversation with Margaret Adamson. She's handling my divorce, and she'll be happy to represent you too. If you want, our cases are pretty much a shoe-in. She says we talked late into the night, and then Dave crashed in my guest room. He didn't have the heart to face Shelley. The phone rang several times, but we didn't answer it, and finally I just left it off the hook. A few days went by, and then a few weeks, and kept calling for a while, leaving me messages of her crying and begging to talk to me, but I didn't answer or call her back. I just didn't see any reason to talk to her. She tried finding me at work, but I'd asked our receptionist to tip me off, and I ducked out of my office each time she showed up. A couple of times I saw her car parked in front of the house when I came home from work, so I just drove right by and stayed away for a couple of hours until she left. Margaret Adamson did her work beautifully. The divorce papers were served. She fought through all the legal maneuvers that its lawyer tried to pull, and a court date was set in his initial conversations with Margaret. He claimed that no adultery had taken place. Once she sent him a copy of the tape, we stopped hearing that line. Instead, he pointed out that the tape was inadmissible. Margaret didn't even dignify that one with a response. She just sat tied. And as the court date approached, Ann's lawyer finally called Margaret to ask for a settlement conference. The day after hearing the tape, Dave moved out of his apartment with Shelley, and into my guest room he drove over and watched the place until she went out. Then called me. The two of us packed up everything he wanted and got out of there in less than 2 hours. He told me I don't want to see her. I don't want to hear a word she has to say. I just want to get the hell away from her. His eyes started to tear up, and I turned away. Was it a good thing or a bad thing that I knew just how he felt? Shelley left me a couple of angry cursing messages at home, a nice counterpoint to ANS remorseful. Once after a day or two, I started screening the messages, deleting any from Shelley, and as soon as I heard their voices, Shelley called Dave at work and sent him letters, but he never responded to them. Margaret was handling his divorce too, and he and I just sat back and let her run the show. To my amazement, the lawsuits against Moran and the health club were resolved. First, the one against Moran never went anywhere. He disappeared one day and left no forwarding address, but the health club, eager to avoid negative publicity, just as Margaret had predicted, reached a $1.1 million settlement. I signed a pledge of confidentiality and walked away with the largest check I'd ever seen in less than 10 weeks. My brother was a rock, and I guess I was for him too. We lived like two bachelors, going out to eat a lot, taking in a ball game from time to time, or just sitting around and talking over a few beers we talked about, and Shelley about our lives with them, about how many great women there were out there just waiting for us. It wasn't easy to believe that last bit, and yet we were really able to help each other. I could see as plain as day that there wasn't a thing wrong with Dave that led to Shelley's behavior. She was simply a selfish 304. Likewise, Dave reassured me that in cheating wasn't a reflection on me, just an indication of how screwed up as Chi was. Neither of us probably believed the other one all that much, but it still helped to hear it. Dave was divorced first. As it turned out, he made it clear that he wouldn't talk to Shelley under any circumstances, and so Margaret handled the whole thing. She told him that Shell had fought for more money at first, but that with the tape she didn't have a leg to stand on. I went into the office with him the day he had to sign the papers. Shell had already signed them. He smiled grimly, shook Margaret's hand, and thanked her, and then went off to the men's room. I heard him crying through the door when I went to find him 3 weeks later. It was my turn. We met on a Tuesday, and then me and the two lawyers, and then her lawyer had agreed to a settlement, but insisted on 2 conditions: that I drop adultery as a reason for the divorce, and that I meet privately with. And before we signed the papers, I told Margaret I was willing to see but not willing to drop adultery. Eventually, we agreed that I'd give Ann a chance to persuade me. If she could do so, we'd change it to irreconcilable differences, that old standby. In a weird way, I was looking forward to hearing what, and had to say maybe I'm a masochist, but I loved her for 10 years, and I couldn't really imagine simply walking away without one final conversation. When I got there and was sitting in the conference room wearing a blue dress she knew I'd always loved. Her hair was shorter, and it looked great. She was pale, but she was the same beautiful woman I had loved for so long. "Okay, and it's your meeting," I said neutrally. My heart was pounding, but I tried to look calm. "Just 2 things, all right? Please don't tell me how much you love me, and don't tell me it was just sex." She flushed, and I could see tears welling up in her eyes. Well, I'm so sorry, but how can I not say those things? I screwed up, plain and simple. I was selfish and thoughtless, and I hurt you. But it was just sex. Nothing but a stupid impulse. I gave in to you. Can't imagine how much I've gone over it. And over it, how many times I wished I had never done it. Yes, well, but you did do it, didn't you? I had no intention of making this easy for her, just being in the same room with her, knowing that we were about to separate for good, and why broke my heart all over again? I went in the window and gazed out. Unwilling to let her see my stricken face behind me, I could hear her crying softly. Baby, it didn't mean anything. You know, it was the dumbest, most hurtful thing I could ever have done to you. I know that, but it meant nothing to me. It has nothing to do with how much I love you. I let her talk a bit more, listening to the pleading tone, the sweet voice I had always loved, but not hearing a single word that I couldn't have predicted. She had nothing to say to me that I didn't already know, and nothing that made a damn bit of difference. After a while, I turned around and came back to the table, sitting down directly across from her, and just so, you know, I still love you very much, but it's over between us. She started to cry again. You took from us, the most precious thing we had together, aside from our love, the bond of trust between us. How could I ever make love to you again, wondering if it was me you were thinking about or Moran and his freak show tool? How would I know whether you were loving me or missing him? And how could I live with you, wondering where you were every time you were 10 minutes late coming home, wondering what you were doing on your lunch hour, wondering whether you'd found another big tool to play around with? I waited. But she had no reply to make. Finally, between the sobs, she said, Please, baby, please, couldn't you give me one more chance and I'll give you a few minutes to think about this one? What if I had met some bimbo with fantastic big jugs and started bawling her on the side for a few weeks? Nobody I liked or respected, just a sexy girl who was a fantastic lay, who gave me a degree of pure physical pleasure that I never got from you. And then you found out about it. Could you stay with me? Could you get past the feelings of hurt, the sense of total betrayal? Could you overcome the doubts you'd have about your own attractiveness, the fears that you weren't ever going to be the one I really wanted? She looked up at me with the saddest eyes I had ever seen. Well, I don't have to think about it. I've thought about it for weeks now. Could I forgive you? Could I take you back if it were the other way around? And the answer is no. I couldn't. I just couldn't handle those feelings. I know that. So, I'm asking you to do something I couldn't do, to be a braver, stronger person than I could ever be, and to give me a chance to make it up to you, a lifetime, to show you how sorry I am and how much I love you. There was silence, a minute, 2 minutes, as we looked at one another, both of us thinking about all we had meant to one another, and how we had arrived at this point. I stood up slowly, myself, and hating her for cheating on me and now for throwing it all back on me. I don't know whether I can't do it or won't do it. But I'm not that braver, stronger person you want me to be. Goodbye. And I waited by the open door for a moment, looking back, giving her a chance for the last word. She had her head down. Crying, she didn't say anything else. Margaret was waiting for me down the hall. A surprisingly sympathetic look on her hard face let her have irreconcilable differences. I growled, It doesn't make a damn bit of difference to me. Dave and I sat at my kitchen table. We'd had a few, but we weren't drunk. Listen, I said. I've made some plans. He nodded, and I went on. After the lawyer fees, I still have nearly $800,000 from that settlement. I've invested all but $50,000 of it in some nice, safe places, so there will be a lovely nest egg for when we're old and feeble. But the last 50 grand has been designated to Will and Dave Harris Recovery Fund, and we're going to start spending some. I've rendered us 4 weeks at a 2-bedroom condo in Cancun starting 2 weeks from now. Go tell your office you're taking some time off. We are going to be a pair of fun-loving bachelors, 2 gay divorces, if you know what I mean. He just raised an eyebrow, and I laughed. No, a whole gay, as in cheerful. We've done enough moping around, telling each other how badly we've been screwed over. Cancun was a blast, or at least as much of one as it can be for 2 guys recovering from broken hearts. We got a lot of sun played, a lot of tennis, swam a lot, and drank a lot, though we kept one another from going off the deep end. With each passing day, we got Tanner a little fitter and slightly further from the nightmare we just lived through. And let me say, God bless my charismatic and charming brother. Despite the blow to his self-confidence that Shelley had laid on him, he got his old groove back, and we had a lot of female companionship, his favorite stunt. And damned if it didn't succeed 75% of the time, was to spot 2 attractive women sitting together. He dragged me straight over to their table, smile winningly, and say, Pardon me, ladies. I'm sure you wouldn't be comfortable letting a stranger buy you a drink, so let me introduce my brother, well, Harris. Then it was up to me, the shy one, to say delighted to meet you both. This is my brother Dave Harris, then. He would step back in. Few glad that's taken care of. Now may we buy you a drink? By this time, the women were usually at least grinning, if not laughing, and we'd mostly find ourselves with female companionship for the evening. Sometimes the companionship lasted until breakfast, after all. Unattached women in Cancun were as eager for fun as we were. I had maybe 6 different women in my bed over those 4 weeks, and I imagine Dave's number was a little higher. Mostly it was fun, just laughter and pleasure and keeping it light the first couple of times I made love to a woman. I was tentative, distracted by thoughts of Moran and his huge tool. Even though both he and were thousands of miles away, it was hard to compete with what I knew he had done to her, but the women didn't seem to notice, and being with someone new got easier each time. One-night stands may not be for everyone or for every stage in a person's life, but they seemed to be what Dave and I needed. Only one of the women was different. Shannon, a tall Irish redhead a year younger than I was. We did all the same things, had some drinks, laughed a lot, went for dinner, did some dancing, and back to my place to bed. She was sexy and responsive, as eager to be with me as I was to be with her. We had a lot of fun when it got different. It was later around 3 a.m. For some reason, I woke up and just lay in bed. Shannon softly breathing in sleep beside me. Thoughts of filled my head and all that we had had together and how it had been taken from me. I started crying very quietly. And before I knew it, Shannon was kneeling beside me, holding me in her arms, saying, "Let it out, baby, it's okay." I was embarrassed, but I couldn't stop. She kept soothing me, and finally, in response to her urgings, I told her the whole story. By the time I was done, the sun was rising. We shuffled into the kitchen, and I made breakfast for us while she told me her own story, also a divorce, no cheating. Just a husband who grew ever more distant, ever more driven and career-oriented, until there was just no marriage left. She'd been on her own for nearly 2 years after we ate. We found our way back to the bedroom without a word spoken and made love the night before had been screwing fun. Exciting, friendly, but just sex. This time we looked in one another's eyes, murmured tenderly to one another, and found a very different level of intimacy. My one-night stand with Shannon turned into 4 wonderful nights. In the afternoon, she left. My brother Dave was a little worried about me. I think, come on, bro, time to meet some new ladies. He urged that one was special. I said quietly, I believe you. He said I liked her too, but she's gone home now, Will, and we have 10 more days to spend down here. I'm not ready to stop having fun yet. He dragged me off to the tennis court, then the pool, and by that evening we were chatting with 2 secretaries from San Francisco on their very first trip outside the United States that night. They slept in their own hotel room, but the next afternoon Barbara joined me in my room for her first ever sex on foreign soil. Dave and I went out for dinner at a steak place we both liked. It had been 8 months since Cancun. Dave had long since found a terrific apartment he'd liked, but we still spent a lot of time together just after we ordered. Dave leaned forward and said quietly, "Don't turn around, okay?" Across the room, 2 couples just sat down. One of them is an INOM guy. I was glad for the warning. My heart was suddenly thumping, and I wouldn't have wanted my reaction to show. I waited a few seconds, then casually turned and looked across the dance floor and had spotted us already and was looking steadily over at me. I gave her a friendly, non-committal smile and a wave, and she smiled back at me. Then I forced myself to turn around and chat some more with my brother. "This is the first time you've seen her, isn't it?" he asked. "Since the divorce," I nodded. I didn't think I'd have this much of a reaction, but I guess the surprise has something to do with it, just to me. "A favor." I said, "Let and enjoy our dinner. Don't tell me anything about what she's doing over there. How she looks, I don't want to know. That's fine," Will, he replied, and launched into a funny story about a coworker who'd been flirting with him for a couple of weeks. He wasn't terribly interested in her, but was enjoying the game. We were sitting over our coffees, idly watching the dancing couples, when I felt a hand on my shoulder, and that familiar voice said, "How are you, Will?" I stood up and looked into Anne's eyes, her smiling face hello again, and I managed again, taken by surprise, "How about a dance for old time's sake?" she asked, and I said of course I'd be delighted. How good she felt in my arms, how beautiful she looked, and how much I remembered happier times with her. We talked banalities at first, her job. My job, wasn't it cold for this time of year? Then we fell silent. I was lost in the sensations of having her in my arms again, and all the times we had danced together, and how we wouldn't be doing that anymore or anything else towards the end of the dance, and pulled back. Enough to look into my eyes. How are you? Well, really, I wanted to be honest, though I certainly didn't owe her anything. I'm all right, pretty good. I guess some days are better than others, seeing you tonight dancing with you. It's very powerful. I didn't know I would feel this much. She looked at me very seriously. Well, I'm not so all right. I miss you every day. I don't think you can imagine what being in your arms again does to me. I didn't know how to respond, so I was silent. The last chords of the music sounded, but it wasn't ready to let me go. Have you ever wondered if you made the right decision? Well, I'll be completely honest and okay. I still think about you and me all the time, but I usually don't get much past wondering why you made the wrong decision when I dropped Dave off. He said, "Are you sure you're okay?" Will, I sighed. Yeah, it was a shock, but it was bound to happen sooner or later. This isn't such a big town. Are we still on for tennis after work tomorrow? Dave said yes, and I had it home. I stood in the dark bedroom and undressed as quietly as I could, but when I climbed into bed, she rolled over towards me. How was the evening with Dave? It was nice. Strange, actually. Maybe it was a good thing you were tired tonight because I ran into and at the restaurant probably just as well I didn't come. I might have scratched her eyes out. Do me a favor. Okay, Shannon, could you just hold me for a few minutes? I saw her loving smile, her teeth white in the darkness. I'll do better than that, baby. Come on over here and let me make it all better. I smelled her delicious scent as we embraced and felt her gentle kisses along the side of my neck. Dear listeners, help us reach 1,000 subscribers on YouTube. Something super special awaits once we hit that milestone. Subscribe now and join the fun.